Hello, Jim of Shiloh Hall, with a discussion, deliberation on what is the promised land. So it would have been my understanding until a few years ago that the promised land was always talking about Israel, and really, generally in context of historic Israel, of the old covenant, things past, the land promised to them. But now I think most of us have understood and know that the promised land continues to be referenced and has some sort of involvement at the end of time, when everything comes back around. But I think in the last few years I've been learning to really delineate what the promised land of the old writings really is. So, well, let me just get started. Okay, so as most are aware, Abraham is told to leave the land of his ancestry, the land of Ur, and go to the land of Canaan, the promised land. Well, when he comes from these lands over here to the north and south, north and east, he comes into this land here. And he comes really around this area of Shechem, where you will find some of the mountains that they're talking about. I believe we'll see it in some other maps here. I believe some of the like Mount Hebron, I believe. Doesn't really matter. There are mountains around here, and this is pretty much where he brings Abraham and tells him, "Look around, because this is the land I'm going to give you and your descendants." And later, of course, he says, "By the way, I'm going to make you a great nation, and out of you come many nations." But the promise of the land is related to this area, and so this also is the land, and this map would be a good map for the time of Moses. So when Moses leads them out of the wilderness and they end up between the two mounts, I think it's Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, which are the two mountains here by Shechem, by the way. I believe this is here. And I believe this is where Moses is giving them that final admonition. If you will follow the instructions and the ways and the Torah of Yahweh, you will be Baruch. If you do not, you will be cursed. And so this is where it took place. And this is the land of Moses. And this is what was going on around that time as they have come into land. Here's the Philistines in the red. Here's the Ammonites over here in the yellow. Here's the Moabites down here. And here's Edom down here in yellow. And apparently that's the former land of the Horites. And here's the kingdom of Bashan, King Og, the giants up here, King Og the giant. So anyway, this is what the land looked like, but this is all the promised land. All of this land is what pretty much Abraham was promised. And this is pretty much what it looked like when Moses and the nation of Israel comes back. Now here is that same land now divided up amongst the tribes after they come in and go through all of their campaigns where they rid the land of the Canaanites mostly. I mean, they never did fully do it, I guess, but this is really what the land would have looked like then by the time David and Solomon got done. These were how they occupied the land. So this would be the land of Israel. And here are some additional lands: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza down here. All of this. Now, I've heard, I don't really see it so much in, and I really don't want to overly speak to it, but I've heard that even, from the lands promised to Abraham, it's a much bigger land than this. And I will agree with it. And I'll show you in a moment. I'm not sure how I would document it, how, they'll go up to the Euphrates River up here and some other places and show this land, but I will show what the real promised land should look like when everything is said and done, at least in terms of size. Let's see. So here's the land of Israel. This would be the land of Israel as it exists during the time of the kings, and you got Damascus up here. These are the various nations around Israel, which would have been in this. Let me see if I can get that pointer here a little better. This would be Israel in this area, and these are all the lands surrounding it that were troubling them and giving them trouble during the times of the kings. And here's Assyria. Assyria comes into Israel and takes Israel, removes them to Israel, and takes people from Assyria. Did I say Israel? I meant Assyria. Then they take people from Assyria back to that land of Israel. Later, Assyria is conquered by Babylon, and Babylon becomes all of this area. And then Persia later conquers Babylon and becomes all of this area. And during the days that Babylon was conquering Assyria, Egypt had been coming up into the land, but they were also conquered by Babylon and then relegated back to their lands here. But this is what it looked like during the days of kings. This is what it looked like in the days just prior to the captivity, because Assyria was still there and such. So, and then here is what Israel looked like in the time of Messiah. And here's Galilee. Here's where let me get my pointer a little better again. So here's where Messiah was born and grew up. Um, here is Capernaum, which is where Andrew and Simon, Peter, and John and his brother are from. Here's Bethsaida. You'll hear reference. I believe this might be. No, I'm not sure, but it doesn't. Here's Bethsaida. It gets referred to a lot up in the land of the Galanites. I don't know. Um, Here is, sometimes you'll see the Sea of Galilee referred to as the Sea of Gennesaret. But here is the land of Galilee that Messiah spends a lot of time in. Here's the land of Decapolis that he's referring to, where you got the possessed man with all the demons in him. Here is the land of Samaria, where the people that had been deposed and transplaced or moved into the land from Assyria. This is where their primary um, this is where they reside mostly. This is the land that they were occupying primarily. Here's Samaria up in this area. This would also, she comes up here, I believe. Uh, but then here's Judea down here. And this is where, when you hear Yahushua or Jesus having to go from Judea through Samaria to get to Galilee, he's going through Samaria. She comes over here somewhere, and he's going through Samaria each time as they go from Judea to Galilee and back. Here is Qumran, which would be where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Bethabara in the King James, Beathabara, and many others. But this is where I don't really want to overly state it, but I think this is where the compound was that the sons of Zadok were occupying and working from. This would be the wilderness of Judea, and this Jordan Valley, in the Judean desert here, in the Jordan Valley, beyond the Jordan, in the Jordan Valley, in the wilderness of Judea. This would be where John the Baptist was running around baptizing, and they have found the ruins of what would be baptismals in this area, this Bethabara area. Now, we understood John to be baptizing in the rivers and in the waters around here, I guess, but they also appear to be. There appears to be a little bit more formality to what John the Baptist was and what he was doing and what he comes from. Terry, my wife, just discovered here just recently in some of the writings that have been hidden from us some discussion and some description of what these baptisms were. Very interesting. But okay, so this is what Israel looked like during the time. Oh, let me also just point out here quickly, just because I think it's interesting, but uh, when you hear in scriptures in the New Covenant writings, when they're talking about Herod and his brother Philip and Antipas, well, these regions, you have to go back to the Hasmoneans. These were Hasmonean kings, where before Rome came in, first Greece had conquered the land after Persia. Greece came in and conquered the land. And then Rome came in and conquered the land. Well, let me just stay with Greece for a second. So under Greece, we had the Maccabean folks come along. There's a lot to discuss there, because there's a lot of information we haven't had that we do now have, at least in part. Um, but we have this period of time that we call the Hasmoneans that occurred during and after the time of the Maccabees, during as the Greek Empire was failing and Rome was coming on the scene. The Maccabeans and the Hasmoneans really were running this land and uh, through Israel, and they had kings. They had kings. So when we say King Herod, King Herod was a Hasmonean king. Antipas, he's part of that Hasmonean dynasty. Philip, Hasmonean dynasty. Herod Antipas, Herod's dynasty. Now, during the time when Messiah was born, it was Herod that was the king and running the Judean area. But um, they as Rome came in, Rome would find ways to govern the land, and they would at different times bring in a Roman governor to run the land, but then sometimes they would turn it back over to the Hasmonean kings and rulers of these areas. Like Antipas was ruling Herod Antipas was ruling this Perea. uh, Philip was doing Galantis. Herod Antipas, another one, I don't know, in the territory of Galilee. And then you had this. Anyway, you get the idea that this was broken up during the times of Messiah. That's why you see King Herod and referring to his brother. They were ruling areas of this holy land under the under in cooperation with the Romans. And sometimes it would be the Romans would move a Roman person in to govern the land instead of a Judean or one of the kings of the Hasmonean dynasties. Okay, so that's addressing where it was, but let's talk for a moment about what it was, because in the days of Abraham, uh, it was just going to be a wonderful land that his posterity was going to inherit. In the days of Moses, as they were promised and all excited because they had, while Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived in the lands of Israel, it had never really come to much. I mean, and it wasn't their land. They were occupying it, but it wasn't really their land. But they were living in it before they went down to Egypt. Once they went down to Egypt, they weren't even living in there. And then Israel spent 400 years down in Egypt before they came back to the land. But as they were getting excited about coming back into the land, they called that a land flowing with milk and honey. And they, of course, sent in the spies, and they had the 12 spies go in, and they were kind of wigged out because when they get in there, they see it's full of giants and land that was, I mean, it was just full of big produce, big fruit, big everything about it was big. And but it was just really considered a prosperous land flowing with milk and honey. So they were all excited about it. And it was the promised land. It was the promised land to them. And it was the promised land. It's just now I want to, and the goal of this video is to distinguish how they were perceiving the promised land and what later became against the promised land. That when you get to Abraham and it was described to him, he knew that it wasn't his land, that it was going to be a future thing. I say that because I've heard that, but it also makes sense to me that he understood that that land was not his in the moment. It was going to be for future times. And the same with his son, with Isaac and then Jacob. Um, but again, as the Israelites are coming up into the land, and dealing with and getting ready to go into the land, they had every reason to believe that was the promised land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Um, and when they went into it, it was a wonderful land. It was really, even throughout the time of when they go in and they conquer the land of Canaan, there's warfare and there are things going on, but it remained a wonderful, pristine land full of produce and full of it. It was a bountiful land, and it remained that way. Um, and it remained that way through the judges, through Saul, David, Solomon, and probably even the early kings. But with time, um, because of disobedience, the land was judged. It became judged. And it didn't stay pristine. It didn't stay bountiful. It didn't stay. It became a ruin. It was promised it was going to become a ruin, and then it did become a ruin. So the promised land, if that was the promised land, if that was the promised land, which it wasn't, it's the area of the promised land, but it's not the promised land. If it was the promised land, it's been destroyed. It didn't sustain itself. Now we know that there's going to be some more destruction to follow, but when the promised land comes, it will never be destroyed again. When the promised land comes, it's going to be everlasting. It's going to be everlasting. So so I'll just so when we get to the promises throughout the old writings, constantly they are referring to it as the land, as the promised land, as Mount Zion, as the Qodesh mountain. You'll hear lots of references. You might hear it called different things, but you begin to recognize it as you spend time in the scriptures, and you realize the consistent theme throughout all of the prophets. And this is during the times of the prophets that it becomes more prevalent, because all the destruction and ruin is happening. All the people are in disobedience, and they're just falling away, and everything, all the bad things are happening. So the conversations become more prevalent, where they are talking about the promise of a time of restoration, where we're going to be delivered, and we're going to be brought out of this, and we're going to be brought back into the land. Well, when you begin to distinguish, when you hear Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel talking about the land, you begin to distinguish when he's talking about the land literally at that time and in those areas during that time versus the promised land. When you hear Jeremiah talk about the promised land, he's talking about the hills that produce tremendously, and the cattle and the different things. And nobody's going to make anybody afraid anymore. There is no more. When the promised land comes, there is no more again, ever again, anybody going to be allowed to uh, mess it up, to defile it. It's not going to happen. Clearly, that land in Israel has been defiled. It's getting defiled today. It's never not been defiled, but the promised land, when you listen to Jeremiah and you listen to Ezekiel and you listen to Isaiah, know when the promised land comes, nothing unclean is going to be allowed in. The world that will be outside of Mount Zion, which in our now we understand to be New Jerusalem. In the New Testament writings, we understand that to be New Jerusalem. So when they refer to it as Mount Zion, the Qodesh mountain, the promised land, the land, they're referring to what we in our current cultures are calling Mount Zion, this big city that Yahushua has gone up into the heavens to prepare. He's preparing that place for us. And that's where our mansions are going to be. And that's residing in heaven right now. But it won't be, because at the end of the time, at the day of the Lord, once things have been done on this earth, it's coming down. That is the promised land. What is in heaven now is the promised land coming to earth. That is the promised land. And we've never seen it. Israel's never seen it. That land has never seen it. That land that is over there, and I'm pointing to a map if you're curious on my computer here. But that land has never been what it's going to be. Um, so everything in that area that involved the Israelites in the promised land during their heyday, it was the promised land. It was the promised land. It was the area that the promised land is going to be in. And it was the land promised to them for that season, but it's not the promised land. And you shouldn't, if you want to stay together, if you want to be able to delineate and parse what you're hearing, you need to understand the difference between the promised land as the Israelites have lived it and the promised land that is promised to them and us who have joined them. But the promised land is promised to them. And they understood it that way. By the time you're dealing with the prophets who are sharing all of this information and this hope and this expectation of the promised land, they already knew that their promised land had been destroyed. It had been subjected to judgment. And when they're talking about their hopes, they're talking about something coming. They're talking about the same thing we as Christians would be talking about when we are hoping for that new Jerusalem. Well, they're hoping for the new Jerusalem. Back then, they knew that their promised land was destroyed and that they had a promised land coming. They had a promised Messiah coming. They had a promised land coming. They had a promised gathering together. They had a promised high, a life everlasting coming with Messiah as king. So all of this promised land was always, even in the old writings, it was always I'm sure they didn't know that it was going to be 2,500 to 3,000 years into the future when they were saying this. They had no clue. In fact, when you think about it, it was when Messiah did come on the scene, they were hoping for this promised land. They were hoping because they understood that the promised land was going to be reigned in this reign of Elohim, in this kingdom of God, that when it did come, it was coming as the kingdom of God with Messiah as king and ruler. So when Messiah showed up, that's why they were thinking, oh my gosh, the promised land is coming and he's ushering it in and he is going to be king and Messiah. Well, what surprised them wasn't, they knew that he was going to be those things because it's clear in the old writings. What they'd missed though was his first advent, his first coming it was not this promised coming. It was not the promised coming of Messiah is the second coming when he comes with his kingdom, with the promised land, making all things new and wonderful. That he's coming. What they missed was the suffering servant coming, where he had to come and earn it all. He had to come and do the work that makes him qualified for everything that he's been given. Sure, he's Elohim. Sure, he's probably never had to go and pay the price, but he did. He literally earned it. So no, he's literally earned it, but he had to come to do that. That was his first advent, and they misunderstood it. They thought it was going to be at that time, when in truth, and I'm sure they didn't realize it was going to be another 2,000 years once they realized he wasn't going to be ushering in the kingdom at that moment. They didn't know it was probably going to be 2,000 years. I'm sure they didn't. But um, they understood that they were awaiting this promised land with the Messiah as king coming. So they knew all along, Israel knew. Israel always knew that their hope, their promise, their expectation was for the promised land that is coming, that we haven't seen yet, and that Messiah speaks of in his Olivet discourse. So our hope for the resurrection, the rapture, the New Jerusalem, our hope was their hope. It's always been their hope. We just don't realize that how much of our promises that we see in the new writings are their promises of the old writings. And once you do see it, you see how large it is. I've heard the adage that you can't understand what Paul is speaking of. You can't understand what Paul is saying until you understand what he's read. Well, when you begin to really, once you realize how important those old writings are, the scriptures that we are to be learning from, once you realize that that's where we need to be focusing our energies and our efforts and not staying in these new scriptures with doctrines and imaginations, not imaginations like bad. I just mean people have come up with ideas for what Paul is saying, but they're not reading it in the context of the old covenant writings. So they don't. Once you realize that you've got to focus on these and you must learn these so that you can interpret the new writings, then these things begin to take place, and it's kind of fascinating. Okay, so let me try to summarize what I just did. What I'm trying to delineate, I'm sure many of you know, but just in case, most of us, me, when I historically have read the promised land in the Old Covenant writings, I understood it to be the promised land that Israel experienced in their day in history. I did not necessarily understand that they understood that the promised land that they were referring to in most of their writings was not the promised land of that day. They understood that they were awaiting the promised land that we are awaiting. The Israelites knew that they were awaiting the New Jerusalem. They knew that. And all of that period, just the whole thing, I'm going to say that that new covenant, because that is the new covenant, which I'll cover in another video, because this second advent, this second, when all of this comes, when Jesus comes again and we have New Jerusalem coming back and all things new, that's the new covenant um, of Jeremiah 31. So they understood that they were looking forward to the New Jerusalem too. So let me go to then Revelation, where we see Jerusalem. First of all, Messiah refers to New Jerusalem as, the mansions and the things that he's going to prepare, so that where he's at, we can come, etc. But later in his revelation to John, he kind of describes for us this New Jerusalem, which we knew. I mean, you can read in Jeremiah how cool it's going to be, and it's going to have literal hillsides. It's not all city. This New Jerusalem, if it conjures up in you like it did me, this idea of this New York City style city, I'm sure there are some components like that there are going to be some upward things and people living high and different things, but there's going to be landscape, there's going to be land, there's going to be cattle on hills, there's going to be farming, there's going to be trees, there's going to be vineyards, there's going to be people, kids playing in the grounds and different things. When you read Jeremiah and Isaiah, you see what it's like, and it isn't just this big city environment like say a New York City that comes down. Uh, but when we get to the New Jerusalem, we begin to see the size of it. I've heard differing numbers, and I think it maybe varies by the translation that you listen to. But when in Revelation 21, when the New Jerusalem comes down, um, I've heard 1,500 miles. But in the translation that I've been reading from, they say that the size of the New Jerusalem is 12,000 stadium, and that's 12,000 stadium wide. So you have 12,000 stadium this way, 12,000 stadium this way, 12,000 stadium this way, and 12,000 stadium that way. Well, it turns out if you look up a stadium, it's 600 feet. You take 12,000 stadium times 600 feet, that is 7.2 million feet. And if you divide that by 5,280 feet per mile, that equates to basically 1,363 miles, 0.64. So around 1,364 miles. So whether it's 1,364 or 1,500 miles, I don't know. And it really doesn't matter because it's big. Not only is it um, that big in area, circumference area, land mass, where we go this way, that way, and that way, we go up the same amount. Whether I've heard stories, I've always envisioned a cube, but I've heard that it could be a more like a pyramid, and I guess because if you've got, let's just say 14 to round it out, make it easy for this conversation. So you've got 14 squared at the bottom. Well, you could have 1,400 going up squared on all sides and then 1,400 across, or you could have a pyramid going up, 1,400. It doesn't really matter to me because it's clear that this is a big land. And again, it's not all city, but it is all up in heaven right now, and it is all what's being made and is going to come down um, at the end of time. And it's going to, we're going to have the day of the Lord at the end of this age. We're going to have the day of the Lord, and then we're going to have Messiah come on the scene. He's going to whisk us away, and I'm going to do in a moment. I'm going to do another video on that. He's going to whisk us away to the New Jerusalem, where we're going to hang out for a little bit and then come down with the New Jerusalem. So let me give you some ideas of how big this makes it be. Okay, so I did some Google mapping here, and here is the center, assuming this is going to be the epicenter of where the New Jerusalem is coming down. This would be Jerusalem, so this would be the epicenter. This would be where it all starts from. So I started here in Jerusalem, and I went 12,000 stadia, 1,363.64 miles east. And then I went north, and then I went west, and then I went south. and then I squared it off like this. So if this is the correct, we know 12,000 or something similar to that, 13 to 1,500 miles is um, the length and width of this. And if it is squared off like this, then this is the land mass that the New Jerusalem will occupy. So here we are starting with New Jerusalem. It comes clear over here, past Baghdad, and it comes over to here. And then it's going to go on up into Armenia, and it's going to go all the way over to Bulgaria. And it's going to go all the way down into Libya. It's going to encompass Egypt. Here's what's the river down there? The Nile River. Here's the Euphrates. Is this the Euphrates here? I believe this is the Euphrates River that's referenced. Oftentimes, there's another river referenced, and I don't remember which one it is. But this is huge. This is where the New Jerusalem is set to sit down. Now, you know that in the end, before the New Jerusalem comes down, first is the day of Yahweh. We are whisked away. We're not here for it. But during that day, you've got, in the various prophets, you've got the army of Joel. You've got the heavenly messengers that are going to come down, and they are coming into this land, and they are going to wipe it out. And you're going to see when all of this gets done, and this is where the armies of the world, throughout the world, they're going to try to coalesce upon Messiah here. So there's going to be this whole, during the day of Yahweh, there's going to be the Joel's army come through. There's going to be earthquakes. And then ultimately Messiah is going to land in this area. He's going to land on his feet are going to land on the Mount of Olives. And from there, he and his armies are going to destroy the armies of the world in Armageddon. And this is all taking place in this area here. But when you read the descriptions of the day of Yahuwah in Isaiah and Joel and in other places, I'm sure people are familiar with the idea of the mountains being laid low, the valleys lifted up, the sea moving away because there is no more sea. This whole area is going to be devastated. The mountains of this area are going to be leveled and made flat. The valleys of this area are going to be filled up and leveled. The waters are going to go away. And this is all going to look different. This sea's not going to be there anymore. This landmass will be there, but it will set under the new Jerusalem. All of these land masses will. So all of this will be made into a foundation. All of this land here is going to be made into a foundation for the new Jerusalem. Now, let me say I am speaking that way. I don't know that for a fact, but this is what I've read, and this is what I believe is going to happen. So let me be clear. I'm not trying to say it's definitely going to happen this way. It just seems that this is what I've read. This is what it all appears to be. This clearly is the size of the New Jerusalem. Is the New Jerusalem going to just hover above the land, or is it going to come all the way down on the land and sit? I think it's coming all the way down on the land and going to sit. Otherwise, you just got this big shadow over this land. It would make no sense. And then when you get all the descriptions of the mountains being leveled and the valleys being brought up and the whole land being leveled and the seas going, it all makes sense that it is going to be prepped and prepared as a foundation for the new Jerusalem that's going to come down. And the new Jerusalem, it's going to have mountains, it's going to have hills, and we're going to have, it's not all going to be city. Let's just say this is all city here, and then all of this out here is going to be mountains and hills, and maybe your mansion's going to be set in here. I'm going to be living over here. I don't know. It's going to be pretty, whatever it is, it's going to be really cool, really awesome. But this is the Qodesh mountain. This is Mount Zion. This is the New Jerusalem. This is all of those things. And if you're reading the old covenant writings, old writings, you know that nothing unclean is coming in anymore. There's nothing. The world is still going to exist out here during that 1,000-year reign of Messiah, reigning from here. He's going to come down. Messiah is going to be here and reigning in his mikdash, in his home, in his dwelling. He's from his king and the throne. He's going to be reigning, and he's going to be reigning the entire world. He's going to be reigning from here, and the Torah is going to go out from here. The sons of Zadok will be serving in here again, and it'll all be happening inside of this new Jerusalem. All the kingdoms of the world will flow to their holy mountain, and they will bring their gifts to there. They'll come here every year. They're going to come here, according to Zechariah. So So in the millennial period, when this has come down, this is going to be the epicenter of all activity for all the worlds. And you can see, as big as this is, though, it's nothing compared to the rest of the world in terms of size. And there's going to be people groups living out here. It's going to be devastated at the beginning, but there will be survivors, and they will begin to repopulate and rebuild. They've got 1,000 years to do it, and that's a long time. By the time the millennial period is up, there's going to be a pretty good sized population out there. And if you are reading scriptures, you know that at the end of that millennial period, Satan is loosed again, and he goes out and he does successfully talk all these guys into marching on Jerusalem again. And it's not gonna work. At the end of Revelation, that by the breath of his, just the breath of his, fire from his breath is going to come out and consume the armies that march on New Jerusalem at that time. And it's at the end of that 1,000-year period that the flesh that exists out there, when it all comes to the end of that 1,000-year period, all flesh is going to be raised. All of us are going to go before the great white throne judgment. And when all is said and done at the end of that 1,000-year time, you're going to have the people will either be judged, and they will be judged as righteous or not righteous. The righteous will be given the same bodies we are, that we've been living in for 1,000 years. The righteous are going to be given those. The sheep, when you get the great throne judgment, where you got the sheep on the right and the goats on the left, those on the right are going to be given our bodies. They're going to be given the spiritual body as well. Those on the left are going to be judged. They're going to be raised unto judgment. And then all of the spirits of history, Satan and Azazel, all of these, these various spirits, and all the people who have died in unrighteousness, who have never received, never really wanted Yahweh, all those who died in righteousness are going to be raised at that time for their judgment. And those are the folks that are going to be destroyed. So at that point in time, all flesh is done. You're either going to be in the resurrected body here or destroyed. So at the end of when it says the last enemy to be swallowed up is death, that's because at the end of that 1,000 years, there will be no more flesh that dies. We will all be in our resurrected. I mean, we will have been living there for 1,000 years, but the righteous from this millennial period are also going to be raised up. And together we are all going to be living in flesh with Elohim as our God, our Father, and our Elohim, and we as people in perfect harmony, perfect ability to live in Torah and righteousness according to the ways of Yahweh. We will all be living in harmony. There will be no more flesh to die. So I'm sorry, I probably didn't mean to go all of that direction. But maybe it was meant to be. I don't know. But just to finish up this video here, this is the size. This is the new Jerusalem. This is the promised land that they living here. They knew this wasn't this little bit they were living. This was not the promised land to them. Ezekiel knew, Isaiah knew, Jeremiah knew, the people who were paying attention knew they were awaiting this promised land, the new Jerusalem. So, okay. So I guess I'll finish here. The promised land is not the promised land. It's not Israel as we know it and see it today. The promised land is the New Jerusalem that is coming down. And that New Jerusalem that is coming down, that is our promised land, is the same promised land that Israel in history, Abraham, understood and knew this was the promised land that they were hoping for and waiting for. They didn't know it was going to be so far in the future, but this is the same promised land that they were hoping for. All right, we'll end it here. Thanks, and may you be